Hacker News Weekly, Top 10 Stories from September 14th to 20th, 2025. Welcome back to Hacker News Weekly, where we dive into the stories that got the tech community absolutely fired up this past week. From September 14th through the 20th, we sifted through 209 stories to bring you the top 10 that dominated the discussion boards. And wow, what a week it's been. We're talking about everything from disposable vapes running web servers, yes, you heard that right, to Nvidia dropping $5 billion to buy into Intel, completely reshaping the semiconductor landscape. We've got stories of corporate shakedowns, privacy battles, and software that's literally destroying people's precious memories. These aren't just the stories with the most upvotes. These are the ones that sparked the most passionate debates, the heated arguments, and in some cases, the most existential crises about where our industry is headed. Over 10,000 comments across these stories show just how deeply these issues are hitting home for the tech community. So buckle up. We're about to take you through a week that perfectly captures the beautiful chaos of technology in 2025. The episode. Let's kick things off with a story that shows just how insane our throwaway culture has become. Hosting a website on a disposable vape. Yes, you heard that right. Someone actually turned a disposable e-cigarette into a web server, and the implications here are both hilarious and deeply troubling. So here's what happened. A hardware hacker got their hands on one of these supposedly disposable vapes and discovered something wild inside. Instead of some basic, bare-bones chip you'd expect in throwaway electronics, they found an ARM Cortex-M0 Plus microcontroller, specifically a PY-32F002B with 24 kilobytes of flash memory and 3 kilobytes of RAM. Now, if you're not familiar with the specs, this is legitimately more powerful than some computers from the 1980s that cost thousands of dollars, and it's sitting inside something people literally throw in the trash after a week or two. The hacker didn't just discover this chip, they actually got it running a web server, like an actual functioning website hosted on the guts of a disposable vape. The technical achievement here is genuinely impressive, but it's also kind of insane when you think about what this means for our throwaway culture. Here's where it gets even more ridiculous. These disposable vapes now come with USB-C ports and rechargeable batteries. USB-C, the same connector on your MacBook or high-end Android phone. The author made this brilliant point that I can't get out of my head. They said, I wouldn't want to be the lawyer who one day will have to argue how a device with USB-C and a rechargeable battery can be classified as disposable. It's such a perfect encapsulation of the absurdity here. The Hacker News community had a field day with this one, over 1,400 points and nearly 500 comments. And the discussion went in some fascinating directions. There's this huge environmental angle that people are rightfully upset about. We're literally throwing away capable microcontrollers that could run basic IoT devices, sensors, or, apparently, web servers. Multiple commenters pointed out this feels like a massive regulatory failure. How did we get to a point where it's economically viable to treat sophisticated electronics as single-use items? But then, there's this interesting counterpoint that came up. One commenter suggested that maybe the USB-C ports and rechargeable batteries aren't there by accident. They might actually be a deliberate loophole to get around disposable vape bans in certain jurisdictions. By making them technically rechargeable, manufacturers can argue they're not truly disposable, even though everyone knows that's exactly how they're used. What really struck me in the discussion was when people started comparing this to other surprisingly capable cheap electronics. Apparently, you can get these Chinese 4G dongles for like $4 or $5 that have even more impressive specs. We're talking quad-core processors, half a gig of RAM, running full Linux. The hacking community has been repurposing these things for all sorts of projects, which is awesome, but it also highlights just how much computational power we're treating as essentially worthless. There's this weird duality here that I think captures something important about where we are technologically.
On one hand, it's absolutely incredible that we've made computing so cheap and ubiquitous that we can afford to put ARM processors in disposable products. That's a genuine achievement for humanity. But on the other hand, should we? Just because we can manufacture these chips for pennies doesn't mean we should be filling landfills with them. The environmental implications are staggering when you scale this up. Millions of these devices get thrown away, each containing a rechargeable lithium battery, which, by the way, is a fire hazard in waste facilities, and a processor that could have been running useful applications for years. Some commenters were calling this an environmental catastrophe, and honestly, they're not wrong.
What I love about this hack, though, is how it makes visible something that's usually hidden. Most people have no idea what's inside the products they throw away. This project literally puts a website on a vape, creating this perfect, absurd demonstration of the problem. It's activism through engineering, showing us the computational power we're literally throwing in the trash. The whole thing reminds me of that William Gibson quote about the future being here but not evenly distributed. Except in this case, the future is so unevenly distributed that we're throwing computers in the garbage while simultaneously having chip shortages in other industries. It's completely backwards. And you know what really gets me? The fact that this is economically rational for these companies. It's apparently cheaper to put a sophisticated ARM processor in a disposable vape than to design a simpler, purpose-built chip. That tells you something profound about both the economics of chip manufacturing and the broken incentive structures around disposable electronics. We've optimized our supply chains to the point where waste isn't just acceptable, it's the most profitable option. Speaking of broken systems and corporate behavior that'll make your blood boil, let's talk about what happened to a nonprofit that's been teaching teenagers to code. Slack has raised our charges by $195K per year. This is one of those stories that starts with a seemingly mundane pricing dispute, but actually reveals something pretty disturbing about how SaaS companies can hold organizations hostage. So here's what happened. Hack Club, which is this amazing nonprofit that teaches teenagers to code, suddenly got hit with what can only be described as a shakedown from Slack. They'd been paying about $5,000 a year on a nonprofit rate, which seems reasonable, right? Then out of nowhere, Slack, or really at this point Salesforce, comes in and says, hey, you need to pay us $50,000 immediately. Oh, and going forward, that'll be $200,000 a year, please. The kicker? They gave them less than a week to come up with the money. Not a week to negotiate, not a week to explore options, a week to pay up, or they would deactivate the entire workspace and delete 11 years of message history. 11 years. Can you imagine all those conversations, all that institutional knowledge just gone? What makes this particularly egregious is we're talking about a nonprofit that helps teenagers learn to code. This isn't some venture-backed startup with deep pockets. It's an educational organization doing genuinely good work in the world. And the price increase wasn't like 20% or even doubling. We're talking about a 40 times increase. 40! That's not a pricing adjustment. What would you even call that? The community response was swift and brutal, and honestly, it was beautiful to watch. The story exploded on Hacker News with over 3,000 points and 1,400 comments, and people were absolutely livid. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't just about one nonprofit getting squeezed. Commenters started sharing similar stories. Turns out, Slack has been doing this to other organizations too. The Kubernetes Project, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they've all been hit with these sudden, massive price hikes. One commenter nailed it when they called this ransomware as a service, because that's exactly what it is, right? They're essentially saying, nice message history you've got there. Be a shame if something happened to it. When your entire organization's communication history is locked up in a proprietary platform and they know you can't easily migrate away, they've got you over a barrel. Now, the story does have what you might call a happy ending. After the social media firestorm, Slack's CEO personally intervened and offered Hack Club a deal that was actually better than what they had before. But should we really be celebrating that? It took massive public shaming for a multi-billion-dollar company to not destroy a nonprofit. That's not exactly a high bar to clear. What really struck me about the discussion was how many people immediately started talking about exit strategies. Mattermost, Zulip, Campfire, suddenly everyone's comparing notes on open source alternatives. There's this dawning realization that if you don't control your data, you don't really control your organization. One day you wake up and someone in a boardroom decides your little nonprofit needs to contribute more to their quarterly earnings, and boom, you're scrambling to find 50 grand or lose everything. The technical people in the comments were particularly interesting. They're talking about self-hosting, about data portability, about never getting locked into a vendor again. But then someone pointed out that even some open source alternatives like Mattermost are starting to cripple their free editions, pushing people toward paid tiers. It's like the whole industry is moving toward this model where they get you dependent, then squeeze. You know what's wild? One commenter initially said they weren't that sympathetic until they realized it was a nonprofit. And I get that perspective. Business is business, companies need to make money. But there's something fundamentally different about targeting educational nonprofits with predatory pricing versus negotiating hard with Fortune 500 companies. The broader implications here are pretty sobering. We've built so much of our digital infrastructure on top of services we don't control. Your email, your documents, your chat history, your code repositories. It's all sitting on someone else's servers, subject to someone else's pricing whims. And sure, the market usually corrects for truly egregious behavior, as we saw here with the public backlash. But how many smaller organizations just quietly pay up or lose their data because they can't generate a viral Twitter storm? This whole saga really drives home that old tech axiom. If you're not paying for the product, you are the product. But apparently, even when you are paying for the product, you might still end up being the product, or at least the mark. And speaking of losing your data, here's a nightmare scenario that'll make you rethink how you manage your photos. Apple Photos app corrupts images is trending on Hacker News with over 1,100 points and hundreds of comments. And folks, this isn't just another minor bug story. So here's what happened. A photographer using an OM System OM1 camera discovered that Apple's Photos app has been silently corrupting their images during import. We're talking about both JPEG and RAW files just getting mangled. And the kicker, they found out the hard way when they lost about 30% of the photos from a family wedding. Can you imagine? You're the photographer at a family wedding, you think everything's imported fine, and then you discover nearly a third of those once-in-a-lifetime moments are just gone. What makes this particularly brutal is how the corruption happens. See, when you're importing from your camera, Photos has this convenient feature where it can automatically delete the originals from your memory card after import. Sounds great in theory, right? Saves you a step. But when the app is silently corrupting files during that import process, you're essentially feeding your irreplaceable memories into a digital shredder without knowing it. The photographer mentioned that initially it was just 1 or 2 images out of thousands, annoying but manageable. But then at this wedding, boom, 30% corruption rate. That's when they completely abandoned their Photos app workflow. And honestly, who could blame them? Now, here's where it gets interesting from the technical side. The Hacker News community really dug into this, and several people think it's a concurrency bug in how Photos handles the import pipeline. When you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, which a lot of photographers do, the app has to merge these files and generate previews. Something in that process appears to be going catastrophically wrong, especially when it's handling multiple operations at once. But wait, it gets worse. This apparently isn't an isolated incident with just this one camera model. The discussion thread is full of people sharing their own horror stories. We're seeing reports of corruption with different camera brands, issues with iTunes destroying music libraries, iCloud eating documents. There's this pattern emerging of Apple's consumer software just not treating user data with the respect it deserves. One commenter made a point that really resonated with me. They said this represents a fundamental breach of trust in what should be Apple's most reliable consumer software. I mean, think about it. Photos aren't just data, they're memories. They're your kids' first steps, your parents' 50th anniversary, that sunset from your honeymoon. And the software that's supposed to safeguard these moments
is quietly destroying them instead. Now, to be fair, not everyone's experiencing this. There's a user named Spike021 who chimed in saying they've imported tens of thousands of photos from Sony cameras over 8 years without a single issue. So it might be camera specific, or it might be one of those bugs that only triggers under certain conditions. Actually, Charles W. brought up an interesting alternative theory. They suggested the problem might actually be with the OM1 camera's USB implementation rather than photos itself. Apparently, that camera model has known issues with its USB connection. Their recommendation: always use a card reader instead of connecting the camera directly. It's more reliable, and honestly, after hearing all this, I'm never trusting a direct camera connection again. The community consensus seems to be moving towards some pretty defensive strategies. Never, ever enable that delete after import option. Always verify your imports before wiping your cards. Keep master copies outside of any proprietary photo management system. Some folks are even going back to good old-fashioned folder structures and avoiding these all-in-one photo apps entirely. What really gets me is that, according to the original poster, this seems to be a known issue that Apple just hasn't fixed. Multiple reports online, people losing precious memories, and radio silence from Cupertino. For a company that prides itself on "it just works," this is about as far from that promised as you can get. The whole situation has really reignited the debate about self-hosted solutions versus trusting big tech with our data. And you know what? After reading through these horror stories, I'm starting to think the paranoid data hoarders with their NAS setups and triple backups might be onto something. Now, let's dive into the world of web development, where things are getting, let's say, interesting with supply chain security. Shai-Hulud malware attack, Tinycolor, and over 40 NPM packages compromised. And wow, with over 1,000 comments on Hacker News, you can tell this one struck a nerve. So here's what's going down. Someone's launched a supply chain attack targeting NPM packages, and they're specifically going after CrowdStrike-related packages, which is kind of ironic if you think about it. The attack's named after those giant sandworms from Dune, which feels oddly appropriate given how it's burrowing through the JavaScript ecosystem. What's really fascinating about the community reaction here is that it's not just, "oh no, another attack." It's more like this collective exhaustion mixed with vindication. You've got developers basically saying, "we told you this would keep happening." And they're not wrong. The discussion has turned into this massive debate about whether NPM's entire security model is fundamentally broken. The big culprit everyone's pointing at? NPM's post-install scripts. By default, when you install a package, NPM will automatically run any post-install scripts that package defines. No questions asked, no permissions required, just boom, arbitrary code execution on your machine. It's like, imagine if every time you downloaded a Word document, it could automatically run whatever macros it wanted. That's essentially what we're dealing with here. And people are getting creative with comparisons. Some folks are pointing out that other package managers like PNPM and Bun have already figured this out. They don't run these scripts by default. PHP's Composer doesn't do it either. It's making NPM look pretty outdated in the security department. But here's where it gets really interesting. The community is split into camps. You've got one group saying, "we just need better sandboxing and permissions," kind of like how mobile apps work. Then you've got another group going full nuclear, saying the entire JavaScript ecosystem with its culture of microdependencies is the problem. They're pointing to projects like ESBuild that have literally 0 dependencies and saying, see, it is possible to build things without pulling in half the internet. There's this one perspective that really caught my eye. Some developers are advocating for just abandoning ship entirely. They're saying, forget all this client-side JavaScript complexity. Go back to server-side rendering with tools like HTMX. It's almost like watching people rediscover that maybe, just maybe, we don't need 500 dependencies to display a web page. And then there's the Rust crowd chiming in, suggesting we replace JavaScript tools with Rust-based alternatives like Biome or SWC. But others are quick to point out that's just moving the problem to cargo. You're still dealing with supply chain risks, just in a different ecosystem.
What nobody seems to disagree on is that something needs to change. The current model, where any package can execute arbitrary code on installation, where projects routinely have dependency trees with thousands of packages, where a single compromised package like Tinycolor can potentially affect countless applications, it's not sustainable. The really sobering part is that this isn't some theoretical vulnerability, it's actively being exploited right now, targeting real packages that real developers are using. And based on the discussion, it seems like everyone's just waiting for the next one to drop because, well, why wouldn't it? The attack surface is massive, the barriers to entry are low, and the potential impact is huge. You know what's wild? Some commenters are comparing this to the Debian model, where packages go through rigorous vetting and curation. Can you imagine if NPM had that level of oversight? We'd probably have way fewer packages, but maybe that's not such a bad thing when you consider the alternative is this. Speaking of security and code execution, here's a story that takes a completely different angle on the trust problem. Want to piss off your IT department? Are the links not malicious looking enough? And yes, that's the actual title, which honestly tells you everything you need to know about where this is going. So someone's created this absolutely brilliant piece of satire called fishyurl.com, and it's basically the anti-URL shortener. You know how services like bit.ly make your links nice and clean? Well, this does the complete opposite. It takes your perfectly legitimate URLs and makes them look as sketchy as humanly possible. We're talking links that look like they're about to steal your grandmother's social security number and use it to buy crypto in the Cayman Islands. The tool lets you choose from different flavors of suspicious. You want your link to look like a crypto scam? Done. Prefer the classic phishing aesthetic? They've got you covered. Online gambling? Dating sites? Adult content? Pick your poison. And the best part? There's literally a setting called Just Fuck Me Up Fam, which I assume generates URLs so suspicious they'd make a Nigerian prince blush. But here's where it gets really interesting and why this struck such a chord on Hacker News with over 1,000 upvotes. This isn't just a joke tool. It's actually brilliant commentary on the absolute mess that is corporate email security. Because, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, companies already do this to themselves. Microsoft's SafeLinks, Mimecast, Trend Micro's security solutions, they all take normal URLs and wrap them in these horrifying redirect chains that look exactly like what we train users to avoid. You click on what should be a simple link to Google Docs, and suddenly you're looking at something like nam02.safelinks.protection.outlook.com/URL equals https:/3f%48, followed by 3 paragraphs of encoded garbage. The discussion thread is full of people sharing their war stories about this. One person mentioned how their company's security training literally shows examples of suspicious URLs to avoid that look exactly like the URLs their own security system generates. It's like teaching someone to recognize a wolf, then dressing all your sheep in wolf costumes. There's this perfect anecdote someone shared about their IT department sending out a phishing test where the test email got flagged by their own security system and rewritten to look even more suspicious than the original phishing attempt. You can't make this stuff up. What really resonates with people is how this highlights the complete theater of corporate security. We spend millions training users to inspect URLs, to hover over links, to look for red flags, and then we deploy systems that make every single legitimate link look like it's trying to harvest your organs. One commenter pointed out they've basically been trained to ignore all the warning signs because everything looks suspicious now. When everything is a red flag, nothing is. And there's a darker side to this that one user brought up. What happens when users get so used to clicking on sketchy-looking URLs from their own IT department that they stop caring? This tool, while funny, could theoretically be weaponized. Serve legitimate content for a while, get people comfortable clicking your ridiculous URLs, then switch to actual malicious content once you've trained them to ignore their instincts.
The technical implementation is dead simple. It's just a redirect service with comedy domains. But the implications are fascinating.
We've created this security infrastructure that's so convoluted, so user-hostile, that a parody tool making fun of it feels more honest than the actual security measures. My favorite comment in the thread was someone saying they're tempted to use this for all their internal company links just to see if anyone even notices anymore. And honestly, they probably wouldn't. When your legitimate enterprise security solution makes links look like secure mail gateway dot definitely not malware dot totally legit dot biz, how much worse can a joke tool really be? This is the kind of thing that makes you realize maybe the real phishing was the security theater we implemented along the way. Now let's talk about a very different kind of security issue, one that involves encryption, privacy, and the long arm of the law. Man jailed for parole violations after refusing to decrypt his Tor node. This one's got nearly 1,000 points on Hacker News, and honestly, the more you dig into it, the wilder it gets. So here's the setup. Konrad Rockenhaus used to run some of the fastest Tor exit nodes in the world. If you're not familiar, Tor is that privacy network that routes internet traffic through multiple layers of encryption. It's used by everyone from journalists in oppressive regimes to, yes, criminals trying to hide their tracks. Konrad was basically providing crucial infrastructure for this network until the FBI came knocking, asking him to help decrypt traffic flowing through his nodes. He refused, and that's where things get interesting. His wife claims that what happened next was pure retaliation. The FBI dug up this old workplace dispute. We're talking about a minor Computer Fraud and Abuse Act violation, and arrested him just months before the statute of limitations would have been expired. Convenient timing, right? But here is where it gets absolutely bonkers. During his pre-trial detention, a U.S. probation officer testified that Konrad was using something called a Linux OS called Spice to access the dark web and bypass their monitoring software. Except Spice isn't an operating system. It's literally just a graphics driver that lets you see the display when you're using a virtual machine. Konrad apparently needed it for his PhD program. This is like saying someone's using a hacking tool called Microsoft Word because they typed a document. The technical illiteracy here is just staggering.
Now, the Hacker News discussion on this gets really heated because people started digging into the court documents, and it turns out there's more to the story. Konrad was actually on parole, and the documents show he violated multiple conditions, using an unauthorized iPhone, cannabis use, mispayments, and potentially trying to bypass monitoring using virtual machines. So you've got this split in the community where half the people are saying this is government persecution of someone who wouldn't play ball with the FBI, and the other half are going, well, he literally violated his parole conditions repeatedly. But even if you accept that he violated parole, the technical misrepresentation is still deeply troubling. Was this probation officer genuinely that clueless about basic computer technology? Or was this a deliberate attempt to make Konrad sound more sinister to a judge who might not know better? Because let's be honest, saying someone's using the dark web sounds a lot scarier than saying they installed a graphics driver for their schoolwork. The community reaction really reflects this broader tension we're seeing around privacy tools. Some commenters are pointing out that running Tor exit nodes has always been legally risky. You're basically letting random internet traffic flow through your connection, and when that traffic includes illegal activity, you become a person of interest, whether you can see that traffic or not. Others are arguing this is exactly why we need more people running these nodes, not fewer, that backing down in the face of government pressure just makes surveillance easier. What really strikes me about this case is how it crystallizes this fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got law enforcement saying we need to be able to track criminals and terrorists. On the other, you've got privacy advocates saying the ability to communicate privately is a fundamental right, and the infrastructure that enables it shouldn't be criminalized. And caught in the middle are people like Konrad who, look, maybe he did violate his parole, but the way this case was handled, with technical testimony that was either incompetent or deliberately misleading, that should concern everyone. The timing is just too suspicious to ignore.
Guy refuses to help the FBI decrypt Tor traffic, and suddenly they're dusting off an old workplace dispute to arrest him, and then keeping him in pretrial detention for 3 years, partly on testimony that a graphics driver is some kind of dark web hacking tool. Even if Conrad isn't a perfect victim here, this feels like a warning shot to anyone else running privacy infrastructure. Cooperate or we'll find something to charge you with. Let's shift to something that's got major implications for the tech industry workforce.
Trump to impose a $100K fee for H-1B worker visas, White House says. This story exploded on Hacker News with over 1,300 points and nearly 1,800 comments. And honestly, I can see why people are losing their minds over this. So here's the deal. The White House is proposing what's essentially a massive paywall for companies wanting to hire foreign tech workers, $100,000 per visa. That's not a fee, that's a barrier. And the tech community is split right down the middle on whether this is genius or insanity. What's really fascinating about the discussion is how it's revealing these deep fault lines in how people view the H-1B program. You've got folks saying, finally, someone's addressing the abuse. Because, let's be real, there are issues. One commenter pointed out that about 50% of H-1B visas go to staffing firms, often Indian consulting companies that bring workers over at below-market wages. They mention Walmart specifically, which apparently has thousands of H-1B workers in roles that, probably could be filled domestically. But here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a bit concerning. The executive order apparently includes this discretionary exemption clause where the Secretary of Homeland Security can just waive the fee at their discretion, and the Hacker News crowd immediately spotted what this could mean. We're talking about a potential corruption machine here. Instead of paying a transparent fee, companies might need to, as one commenter put it, kiss the ring. You want your fee waived? Better hire the right lobbying firm, make the right donations, know the right people. One user made this brilliant point. They said this turns the whole system into a pay-to-play scheme, but not even a straightforward one. It's pay-to-play with extra steps and backroom deals, and that's not fixing corruption in the system. That's institutionalizing it. Now, the other camp is saying this completely misses the point of what makes America competitive. We've built our tech dominance partly by being this magnet for global talent, right? One commenter argued that our strategic advantage has always been brain drain. We take the best and brightest from everywhere else. This move, it doesn't just shut the door, it puts a $100,000 lock on it.
And here's what nobody seems to be talking about enough, the unintended consequences. Multiple people in the thread pointed out that this won't create American jobs. Companies aren't suddenly going to hire local talent at higher wages. They're just going to accelerate offshoring. Why pay a $100K plus salary to bring someone here when you can just hire them in Bangalore or Toronto or Dublin for way less? One person said their company's already drawing up plans to expand their Canadian offices. The timing is interesting too. This comes at a moment when the tech industry is already dealing with layoffs, AI disruption, and questions about remote work. Adding this to the mix, it's like throwing a grenade into an already complicated situation. What really struck me reading through these comments is how personal this is for so many people. You've got H-1B holders talking about their experiences, American workers who've been displaced, hiring managers trying to build teams. Everyone's got skin in this game, and everyone's got a story about how the current system either saved them or screwed them. The fee itself, $100,000, it's clearly designed to be prohibitive for most companies. But for the big tech giants, the Googles and Microsofts, that's a rounding error. So we might end up with a system where only the biggest companies can afford to bring in international talent, which, talk about accelerating inequality in the tech sector. There's also this whole debate about whether H-1B workers actually depress wages. Some commenters are absolutely convinced they've seen it firsthand. Teams replaced with cheaper visa workers, salaries stagnating because companies can always threaten to outsource. Others argue that H-1B workers, especially in specialized roles, actually create more jobs and drive innovation. You know what's wild?
Reading through this discussion, you can almost see the tech community trying to wrestle with these competing values. We want fair wages, we want innovation, we want the best talent, we want opportunities for American workers, and nobody can quite agree on how to balance all of that. The discretionary exemption thing, though, that's what really has people worried. Because at least with a straight fee, even an absurd one, you know where you stand. But when exemptions become discretionary, when it's about who you know rather than what you pay, that's how you end up with a system that's even more broken than what we started with. Now, let's look at a major technical milestone that's been literally years in the making.
WASM 3.0 completed. WebAssembly 3.0 is officially complete. And this is honestly a huge deal that's been literally 6 to 8 years in the making. You know how sometimes in tech we get these incremental updates that are like, oh cool, they fixed a bug. This is not that. So WASM 3.0 just dropped, and the community reaction has been fascinating. Over 1,000 points on Hacker News with nearly 500 comments. And it's this perfect mix of celebration and frustration that tells you everything about where WebAssembly is right now as a technology. The headline features are genuinely game-changing, but they also reveal how much the project has evolved, or maybe drifted from its original vision. Let me start with the big one, 64-bit memory addressing. Finally, we're breaking free from that 4-gigabyte prison that's been holding back web applications. I mean, think about it. Figma, Photopea, any serious video editing tool in the browser, they've all been doing gymnastics trying to work within 4 gigs of memory, while your desktop apps are happily chomping through 32 or 64 gigs without breaking a sweat. Now, theoretically, WASM can address up to 16 exabytes of memory. That's a ridiculous number. That's 16 million terabytes. Of course, browsers are capping it at 16 gigabytes for security reasons, which is sensible, but still, that's a 4x improvement right there. But here's where it gets interesting. The non-web WASM world, they're not putting any caps on this. They can actually use that theoretical limit for massive data processing, scientific computing, whatever they need. And this really highlights something that came up a lot in the discussion. WASM has kind of become two different things. There's browser WASM, which was the original pitch, right? Let's run native code in browsers safely. And then there's this whole other universe of server-side WASM, edge computing WASM, embedded WASM. It's everywhere, except, ironically, deeply integrated with the web itself. The multiple memories feature is actually pretty clever too. So before, if you wanted multiple memory spaces, you had to create separate modules and do this complicated dance between them. Now you can have multiple memory objects in a single module, which sounds boring, but it's actually huge for security patterns. You can isolate sensitive data in completely separate address spaces, copy directly between them. It's the kind of low-level control that systems programmers have been asking for.
And then there's garbage collection support, which, okay, this one's complicated. People have been waiting for this because theoretically it means languages like Java, C#, Python, all these GC languages could compile to WASM more efficiently. But reading through the comments, it seems like what we got is way more low-level than what people expected. Like, one commenter pointed out that C# still can't properly use it because it's missing crucial features they need. It's more like building blocks for garbage collection rather than a drop-in solution. But here's what's really striking about the community reaction. There's this undercurrent of frustration about what WASM still can't do. The big one? DOM access. After all these years, you still can't directly manipulate the DOM from WebAssembly. You have to go through JavaScript, which means you're still paying that interop tax, still dealing with the overhead. And people are asking, very reasonably, I think, wasn't the whole point to eventually replace JavaScript? One comment that really stood out to me said WASM has become a monster of its own that barely has anything to do with web anymore. And you know what? Looking at where the development effort has gone, they might have a point. The features that are landing seem more focused on making WASM a universal computation platform rather than a better way to build web apps. Don't get me wrong, what they've accomplished is technically impressive. The engineering here is solid. But there's this sense that maybe, just maybe, WASM has lost the plot a little bit. Like,
We're getting 64-bit memory addressing, which is great, but we still can't efficiently update a div without going through JavaScript. We're getting sophisticated garbage collection primitives, but most web developers just wanted to write their React components in Rust or Go. And yet, despite all the grumbling, people are building incredible things with WASM. Figma's gonna love that memory limit increase. Game engines are going to take advantage of those multiple memory spaces. The scientific computing folks are probably popping champagne over the non-web memory limits. So yeah, WASM 3.0. It's here, it's powerful, it's complicated. It's a technology that's simultaneously exactly what some people need and not quite what other people wanted. But hey, that's tech for you, right? Sometimes the thing you build becomes something different than what you planned, and maybe that's okay, even if it does leave web developers still writing JavaScript glue code in 2024. Let's shift gears dramatically here to a story that's generating enormous controversy.
Top UN legal investigators conclude Israel is guilty of genocide in Gaza. This one's sitting at nearly 1,400 points with over 1,400 comments, so clearly it's struck a nerve in the community. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. This feels pretty far from our usual tech territory. But here's the thing. This story actually touches on something really fascinating about how international law works in our digital age. The UN Commission of Inquiry has just released this comprehensive 72-page report, and they're saying Israel has committed 4 out of the 5 acts prohibited under the 1948 Genocide Convention. That's a massive finding. What makes this particularly significant is who's behind it. The commission chair is Navi Pillai. She's not just some random bureaucrat. She's the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and actually presided over the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So when she says these UN reports have particular probative value and can be relied upon by international courts, that carries weight. But here's where it gets interesting from a tech perspective. Think about how different this is from documenting atrocities even 20 years ago. We're talking about satellite imagery, social media posts, digital forensics, real-time video documentation. The sheer volume of evidence available in 2024 is unprecedented. Every smartphone becomes a potential witness. Every upload, a piece of evidence. The commission had to sift through massive amounts of digital data to build their case. The Hacker News discussion around this is intense, to put it mildly. You've got people completely rethinking their political positions. Some commenters saying the footage coming out of Gaza has turned them into single-issue voters. Others are diving deep into the legal technicalities, with one particularly heated debate about John Spencer's counter-analysis, where he argues the report is basically describing urban warfare, not genocide. What's really striking is the frustration bubbling up about enforcement mechanisms. Multiple commenters are pointing out this disconnect between having all this evidence, having these legal findings, and then nothing happening. One person put it pretty bluntly. They're calling for the U.S. to apply the same sanctions framework that it uses elsewhere, particularly targeting AIPAC's special regulatory status. Others are more cynical, saying the international community will just do symbolic things like recognizing Palestinian statehood without taking substantive action. There's also this fascinating technological angle that's barely being discussed but seems crucial. How do you actually prove intent in the digital age? The commission says they've found evidence that Israeli leaders had intent to destroy Palestinians as a group, which is the key legal threshold for genocide. But in an era of encrypted communications, deleted tweets, and carefully managed public statements, how do you definitively prove what leaders intended? The UK government's response is particularly interesting here. They're basically refusing to engage with the finding, but Pillai specifically called them out, urging them to review their position. It's creating this weird situation where you have what the Commission calls the most authoritative UN finding to date, potentially influencing the International Court of Justice case that South Africa brought, but major governments just sort of looking the other way. You know what really stands out reading through these comments? The generational divide in how people are processing this.
Younger commenters seem to be experiencing this real time through social media, seeing unfiltered footage that traditional media won't show. They're talking about how it's fundamentally changed their worldview. Meanwhile, you've got others arguing about historical precedents, international law frameworks, the complexities of urban warfare. And honestly, the fact that this is even on Hacker News and generating this much engagement says something about how tech workers are grappling with their industry's role in global conflicts. Whether it's the surveillance technology being used, the social media platforms where this is all playing out, or just the moral weight of working in an industry with deep ties to defense contractors, these aren't abstract policy debates anymore. They're hitting close to home for a lot of people in tech. The comment threads are revealing some pretty deep fault lines in how the tech community thinks about international law, human rights, and their own responsibilities. It's messy, it's complicated, and there definitely aren't easy answers here, but that's exactly why it's generating such intense discussion. And finally, let's wrap up with a story that could reshape the entire semiconductor industry. Nvidia buys $5 billion in Intel. Yeah, you heard that right. The GPU giant just dropped $5 billion to acquire a 5% stake in their longtime rival Intel, and honestly, the tech world is kind of losing its mind.
So here's what's actually happening. Nvidia and Intel announced they're going to work together on multiple generations of x86 products. We're talking gaming CPUs with integrated RTX graphics. Imagine Intel processors with Nvidia's ray tracing tech built right in. They're calling these Intel x86 RTX SoCs, which is basically taking the best of both worlds and smushing them together into one chip. But that's not even the craziest part. Intel's also going to manufacture custom x86 data center CPUs specifically for Nvidia's AI products. Think about that for a second. Intel, who's been struggling to keep up in the AI race, is now essentially becoming a contract manufacturer for Nvidia's AI ambitions. The $5 billion investment comes in at $23.28 per share, and it caused Intel's stock to absolutely rocket. We're talking a 33% surge in pre-market trading. Now, the Hacker News crowd, with 991 points and 600 comments, people have opinions. They're deeply concerned about what this means for competition. The biggest worry? Intel's Arc graphics division. See, Intel's Arc GPUs were supposed to be this third player that would finally give us an alternative to the Nvidia-AMD duopoly. People are terrified that Nvidia is going to walk in there and say, yeah, about that Arc thing, maybe shut it down. And honestly, that fear isn't unfounded. One commenter pointed out that Arc is literally the only thing keeping GPU prices from going completely insane. Without that competitive pressure, what's stopping Nvidia from charging whatever they want? It's like if Coke bought a stake in Pepsi and then convinced them to stop making cola. The timing here is fascinating too. Intel's new CEO, Lip Butand, just revealed that Intel isn't even a top 10 chip maker anymore. They've been hemorrhaging market share, struggling with their foundry business, and desperately trying to stay relevant in the AI boom. So in walks Nvidia with a $5 billion lifeline. But at what cost? Some folks are drawing parallels to when Microsoft invested in Apple back in '97. Sworn enemies coming together when one really needs the help. But others are seeing this through a more cynical lens. There's this whole geopolitical angle where people think this might be about propping up U.S. semiconductor independence, keeping Intel's foundry business alive as a strategic asset rather than letting it fail. What really gets me is the discussion about Linux support and open source drivers. Several commenters are worried that Nvidia's influence could mess with Intel's traditionally excellent Linux support. Intel's been this beacon of open source friendliness in the GPU space, and Nvidia, well, let's just say Linus Torvalds didn't flip them off that one time for nothing. Now, there are a few contrarian voices in the mix. John Chesterfield actually thinks this could backfire on Nvidia, that merging with Intel might dilute their dominance rather than strengthen it. And Not Null or Void makes a fair point, that $5 billion, while a lot of money, isn't really enough to give Nvidia veto power over Intel's strategic decisions. Killing Arc would be such a massive scandal that it would hurt all Intel shareholders, not just Nvidia.
But here's the thing that really stands out to me. This represents what one commenter called a seismic shift in the industry. These two companies have been at each other's throats for decades. Intel tried to make graphics cards, Nvidia's been eyeing the CPU market, they've been competing for data center dominance, and now suddenly they're partners, with Nvidia literally owning a piece of Intel? The anti-competitive implications are huge. Multiple users are calling for regulatory scrutiny, and honestly, they might have a point. When your biggest GPU competitor owns 5% of your company and you're co-developing products together, where exactly does competition end and collaboration begin? It's like the tech equivalent of sleeping with the enemy, except the enemy just bought your house and moved into the spare bedroom. What we're potentially looking at here is a fundamental reshaping of the semiconductor industry. If this partnership actually delivers on its promises, gaming CPUs with integrated RTX graphics, custom AI processors, it could change everything about how we think about the CPU-GPU divide. But if it kills ARC and reduces competition, well, get ready to pay even more for your next graphics card. And that's our deep dive into the top 10 stories that dominated Hacker News this week. From disposable vapes running web servers to multi-billion-dollar semiconductor shakeups, from nonprofit shakedowns to privacy battles. This week really had it all. What strikes me most about these stories is how they all connect to this larger theme of trust and control. Whether it's trusting your photos to Apple's software, your organization's history to Slack's pricing whims, your packages to NPM's security model, or your industry's future to mega mergers. We're constantly navigating these questions of who controls our digital lives and whether they deserve that power. The discussions around these stories, remember, we're talking over 10,000 comments just on these 10 posts, show a community that's increasingly skeptical, increasingly aware of the trade-offs we're making, and increasingly vocal about demanding better. Whether that's better security practices, better business ethics, or just better engineering that doesn't corrupt our wedding photos. Thanks for joining us for this week's Roundup. If these stories teach us anything, it's that the tech world never stands still, and neither do the debates about where it's heading. We'll be back next week with another collection of the stories that get the Hacker News community fired up. Until then, maybe back up your photos, check your dependency trees, and definitely don't throw away any electronics. You never know when you might need to host a website on them. This has been Hacker News Weekly. Stay curious, stay critical, and we'll see you next time.